Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Stephen King podcast. This is episode 82, and we are closing in on number 100. As usual, I have Lou by my side, at least virtually. We're in different places physically, but mentally we're side by side.
That's
How
right.
are things?
Hi, everyone. Good. How are you?
I'm fine.
Any snow yet?
Yeah, we have some snow now. Not much.
All right.
A little bit. So winter is possibly coming. We don't know.
Possibly. And it's getting to be that time of year. We're into December now. It's December 3rd when we're recording this. So for the rest of the country or countries that don't have snow yet, and with Christmas approaching, hopefully you guys are... It's hard to believe Christmas is only like 3 weeks away, but here we are.
Yeah. Okay, today we are going to talk about Joe Hill's new book, Strange Weather, 4 stories. And we are going to spoil that one if you haven't read it. And about the book Shining in the Dark. And that we're not going to spoil as much since it hasn't been released in that many places yet. So you can listen to that without having read it. But Strange Weather, I would suggest you read before you listen to this, because we might spoil it for you otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But as usual, let's kick off with the news.
All right. And boy, this has got us set a record for the slimmest news lineup that we've had this year. We only have 3 items, but hopefully we're going to make it up with all the other good stuff that's coming in the rest of the podcast. Are you going to mention the guest that we're having today, or?
Yes, exactly. We are definitely going to mention the guest.
Okay, so why don't you make that you can make that the first news item if you want.
Yes.
Welcome. Do not fear the door that lies before you. We will protect you. We are your guides, Hans and Lou, and we will give you the latest in Stephen King news. But before we do so, you must prove yourself worthy. You must open the door and join us in the death room.
We are having Brian Keene guest us today, and he is, if you don't know it, he has written one of the stories in Shining in the Dark, and we're going to talk about that. And this is a story that he wrote called The End of All Things, that's written specially for this book. So you will not have read it. I think he read it out loud at some place. So if you attended that, you might have heard it, but otherwise it will be a new story for you.
Cool. That's very exciting because Brian is one of the masters of the genre right now. He's been around for a while. His first book, The Rising, along with probably The Walking Dead, created what many believe to be the re-interest in the zombie craze, and that was followed up by City of the Dead. And we'll talk about his next sequel, I'm sure, when we interview him. But he's written a lot of other books. I've met him twice, though he probably won't remember it. And it's gonna be really awesome to have him on the podcast. Really looking forward to that.
Yes. First out in the news, or second, is we have some photos from Castle Rock, where they are filming a scene which include Bill Skarsgård, who most of you might know as Pennywise. In Castle Rock, he's not playing Pennywise. He is playing a lawyer. And the photos we got was a bit, strange. They were taken from above.
Yeah.
We don't know if these are, I guess it's not photos taken by the guy shooting the film, because you see the mic and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's probably someone watching the scene being taped.
Yeah. So is he playing a lawyer? I thought he was in jail, or is he a lawyer in jail? Which is interesting because.
No, you're right. I think you're right. It's me messing things up today.
Okay.
I think he is a prisoner, and he's talking to his lawyer in this scene. So.
Or maybe this happens in a flashback before he goes to jail, because they're all dressed up in suits and whatnot, and there's a cat walking across this table or whatever it is. So I'm not really sure if this is in between scenes or if this is actually part of the show.
Yeah, we don't know much about it.
Yeah. So
it's not unusual when J.J. Abrams is involved that there are a lot of secrecy.
Yes, for sure. And we still don't know exactly when this is going to appear next year. So,
no, hopefully sooner than later.
Yeah. So,
yeah,
our next item has to do with the Blu-ray reissues of a lot of Stephen King's movies, and in one of them, Misery has just been re-released by Shout Factory, and there's a pretty good article there, as well as a clip from the bonus features on the Blu-ray, where Rob Reiner talks about how he hammered out the deal with Stephen King to be able to direct and produce this version of Misery. So it's pretty interesting stuff. I mean, it's movie's been out for a long time, and a lot of Stephen King's older films are being re-released in Blu-rays. I've already bought this a couple of times, so I'm not really sure if I'm going to re-buy it, but I might wait until they do like UHD 4K releases. I mean, even though this does feature a new 4K restoration of the film, it's interesting. This movie is really kind of timeless. Obviously, there's a whole predating the cell phone era, but aside from that, the movie holds up really well. I just watched it a couple of months ago with my family, and we all really enjoyed it. So if you're a home theater enthusiast, a movie collector, or just a Stephen King movie collector, just want to make you aware that Shout Factory and other companies are doing a lot of releases of Stephen King's earlier films.
Yeah, and I watched the clip that they posted, and it's interesting to hear that when Reiner found out about the book, it was released in paperback, so it should have been out at least for a year, and still no one had option to do the movie. So I guess that was good for us fans that Rob Reiner got the chance to do it, because he did a great job with it. And so that was interesting to hear. Most books seems to be optioned for movies almost before they are released, or very soon after they have been released. So I think that was interesting to hear.
All right.
And the last news, and we warned you this was going to be a short news section, is about the newest segment of Children of the Corn called Runaway. And this one has been finished, at least we thought so, for a very long time, but not released. But one of the stars posted, Marcy Miller, who plays the lead, I guess, in this movie, posted on Instagram a photo of her doing some new voiceover. Someone in the comment asked her when the movie was going to be out, and she answered February, March next year. So only a couple of months until we can watch the new Children of the Corn movie. And maybe that's the right time to go through them all and do a thorough podcast about them in depth.
Can hardly wait.
I knew you were going to say that.
Guilty pleasures for some, I guess. I mean, I can rewatch Maximum Overdrive any day of the week, as bad as that movie might be, but it's fun. Some of these other ones are just bad, and they're not fun. So that makes it tough.
I agree. They aren't much to watch, but I'm sure I will see it once it's out anyway. So maybe not to rewatch all the others.
Yep. All right.
Okay, and that's it. That's it for the news for this time.
This is great. What's our job? We'd like drive around, pick up stiffs or what?
It's time for reviews from the night shift.
And next up, Joe Hill's book, Strange Weather.
Mm-hmm.
This is interesting because I hope I'm right now, but he started his career with a short story collection.
Yes.
And then he did some pretty thick books after that. And now he's back with a collection of 4 short stories. I don't know what it is, but it seems to be the norm that there should be four stories in a book, not 3 and not 5. Most often there are 4 books. I don't know why, or maybe it's just that I have just read with 4 stories in it. Could be.
Yeah.
I don't know. I must say, when I read this, I didn't think it didn't strike me as a horror book, which I thought it would be. More a supernatural book. Is that the feeling you got when you read it as well?
Yeah, it's definitely not straight horror. It covers a variety of styles, from allegory to science fiction to post-apocalyptic, you could say. So it's not strictly a horror. There's horrific elements in some of them, and one's definitely more of a social commentary than anything else. So
yeah. Should we start by going through them?
Sure.
Just explaining the plot a little bit. Yeah. The book starts with a story called Snapshot, which tells the story about a man with a Polaroid camera who, when he takes a photo of someone, he actually erases some of their memory. And the person who is photographed enough turns to something that looks like an Alzheimer's person that knows less and less about who they are and what they are doing. And we get to follow a kid called Michael who sees this happen to his former babysitter, and he tries to help her from this photonican. Is that pronounced right?
Yep.
And I think this one was a little bit creepy, I think, more than scary. And the fact that someone was taking photos and they forgot stuff when they did, it really got under my skin, I think, this one.
Yeah. Interesting.
I mean, it's something you can't really control yourself if someone takes your photos.
Right.
It's something that's easy to do to you, and you can't do very much about it if they're in a distance. You can't, and it looks so innocent as well that and people won't see it as a threat to you. So I think that was an interesting story.
Yeah, it's probably the least original, because the idea of a camera taking pictures of people and capturing some portion of their essence has been done in other stories. But it reminds me a little bit of Wendy's button box, because he keeps that camera for later use, which is like he puts it away, and then he forgets about it, but then he uses it for something else. So it kind of reminded me of Wendy's button box, and that's an idea that I've seen in other stories, science fiction or horror. In a way, it's a riff off of Dorian Gray idea, right, of capturing somebody's essence and preserving your own life through that. So yeah, it was an interesting story. It's my least favorite of the 4 in the book. So if you're going to order your stories in a certain way, it's probably good to start with the one that you're not going to like as much as the other ones. At least for me, it sounded like you liked it more than I did.
I liked it. I actually have a little bit of a problem selecting my favorite, because they are all pretty different stories, I think. But should we move on to the next one?
Sure.
Do you want to take that one?
Okay. The next one is probably the most controversial one, I would think, in the collection.
Yeah.
And that one's called Loaded, and it's all about the American fascination with guns. And I'm sure that we get a lot of listeners from the States. So the perspective you're going to get on this story from me and Hans, both who do not live in the States. And so our view on the Second Amendment are going to be a lot different maybe than I'm assuming a lot of our listeners are from the States. And I guess about all the stories in this collection, this is probably the one I'd like to hear the feedback from the listeners. But it's just an interesting perspective on how pervasive the gun culture is in the U.S. And it's kind of hard. It's hard to discuss, because on the one hand, I don't want to offend anybody that believes in the Second Amendment, and I'm just saying this is my opinion. And Hans, probably you're going to have your opinion about this, and I'm certainly not telling other people what to think about this. But there's this weird black blind spot in the U.S. psyche about this that's linked to the Second Amendment and guns and the right to defend yourself and all this kind of stuff. I think of this story as trying to show that the pervasiveness of guns leads to, really, this story is like a domino effect of so many different things. And it's sobering to see how I guess that's the main thing, is how pervasive gun culture is in the U.S. And I personally think it's for the bad. I think that in a civilized society, I don't care what country it is, the need for people to have to bear arms to go out in public, it just seems highly ironical to me, that in what is supposed to be if you're living in a country that's free and democratic and believes in individual rights, there's also a common rights to all the citizens of that country. And the fact that you have to arm yourself to feel safe. I don't know. There's just something not working in that kind of world for me. So again, as a non-U.S. citizen, this is just kind of how I view that. So when I'm reading this story, it's just basically preaching to the choir to me. And it's set against this. It's in California, and it's set against all these fires that are going on there. And the initial glorification or hero worship that this one character gets, that slowly unravels as the rest of the story comes out, though the rest of the world is probably not going to know the full extent because, well, I guess they will, because he did kill the sheriff and there's no way he's going to get around that. But a lot of the evidence of what he's doing in the story presumably is going to get erased by the fire, especially at the very end. And there was a moment where Hill was playing with this idea of this swirling cyclone of fire. And I almost thought for a second there, maybe he's teasing at, is that cyclone of fire was going to pick up this guy and kill him or something like that. But it didn't. That didn't happen. And instead, we get the most powerful and abrupt ending in this book of any story that I've read in a long time. And it was quite a gut punch the way it ended. So I try to dance around this. It's hard, though, right? I'm interested to hear what you think, Hans.
Well, I guess I didn't analyze it as much as you did, because in Sweden there is no guns if you're not a military or a hunter. So it feels a bit alienated to me to have a gun at home and have a personal gun and stuff like that. So I thought the most interesting thing about this story actually was the build up for this person that went to place to do something happened, and it really turned out totally different, and he became a hero, and then it started to unravel. And I thought that was the most interesting thing about the story, how the truth changed from why he was there and what the media and people thought he was doing and what he actually did and stuff like that. So right. I didn't think so much about. I guess it's a statement against people having guns, but I thought that was a more interesting angle to the story than the fact that it could as easily to me have actually been about something else. Just the fact that he was there for a reason, something happened, it looked like something else, and stuff got mixed up and then turned around. So I thought that was the interesting thing to see how it developed over time.
Yeah, it's insight into American culture too. And I think, and I'm not excluding myself, because there was certain leaps or connections that characters made that turned out to be incorrect and resulted in people losing their lives. So yeah. It's a very well constructed story. And I think you just made a great point. Like, you could actually even take out the guns, and if the guy had killed these people with a knife or something like that, the story would work just as well. Yeah. But using the guns just obviously made it a lot easier for all these things to happen. So it's violence begats violence, and that's where it all.
I also think that it was I think it was also a good demonstration of Hill, how he introduced us to characters that we in the beginning really didn't know how they connected, or if they even had something to do with each other. And as the story progressed, they all had their piece in the puzzle and fit in really well. So I thought that was also an interesting angle to the story, that you didn't know everyone and you didn't see how they could be connected, but they were, and along the line.
Yeah, and the connection was through guns.
Yeah.
Whether that's good or bad, that's up to the reader to decide. But it was a very well constructed tale, and what an ending!
Yeah.
What an ending! Very powerful.
Yeah, and the next story is the most fun, I think, or the sad. I don't know. I can't decide, but it's definitely the strangest one, I think. Mm-hmm. Even though the others are pretty strange as well, but I think this one, and it's about a guy that is doing a parachute jump to impress on a girl. And we when we meet him, we know that he really doesn't want to do this. He's scared, and he realized that he can't do it. And just as he is about to put a stop to it and not jump, the engine has some problems. And since this is his first jump, he is strapped on the front of another guy who is the instructor. So to to leave the plane, they have to jump. And what happened is that just a little bit below the plane, there's a cloud, and they land on the cloud. And the cloud is like a floating island up in the air. And he can't get down, and he can't do pretty much anything except hang on to it. I thought this was quite fun story at first when he realized he's on the cloud and everything. He can imagine things and they appear, and he find other people up there and so on. And also it's a very sad story just because he can't do anything about it. He's trapped on that cloud. I thought this was a really interesting and unexpected story. I certainly didn't expect him to land on a cloud when he jumped out of that plane. So I think this one was really, really great story.
Yeah, I think out of all four, this is definitely the most original story in this collection. And for that alone, it really pushed it to the top for me, this whole concept of landing on a cloud that's hiding. We assume it's a ship. It might be a creature. We're not, I'm assuming it's a ship because there was metal components in that glass window and all that stuff later on that we found out about. But the whole, it's basically a coming of age story for this one character who has this crush on this girl who doesn't, got this guy is totally in the friend zone as far as she's concerned. She does seem to take a little bit of advantage of him as well. So, and his inability to let go of her is holding him back in his life as well. So during the course of his adventures on this cloud, he gets to exercise those desires or crutches that he's built up for himself around this relationship with the girl that doesn't feel the same way for him. So, and it was interesting too, and it's just a straight up adventure story as well, with him discovering the balloon and the dead bodies and whatnot, using the balloon to parachute the rest of the way to the ground. And so it's fantastical. It almost had a bit of a Jules Verne feel to it in a way.
Yeah.
Kind of. So I really liked this one. It covered a lot of different things. And when I first finished it, I was wanting or disappointed that he never got to talk to the girl again and tell her, and basically that he was ready to move on or whatever. So, and realizing that he needs to get on with his life. So I was waiting for that to pay off to that relationship, but then I really thought, well, we don't really need to see that because we've seen play out, because we've already seen his character growth over the course of the story. So I really like this one a lot. It was whimsical, a bit silly, but it's very original, and it was cool and a high adventure. I really, no pun intended. And I really enjoyed the story quite a bit.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
And then the last story was Rain. And interesting story. It's about a form of, again, a kind of very original. It's about a act of terrorism that causes rain clouds to rain basically spikes or nails that kill people. So, and apparently this is based on fact. There's this compound, I don't remember the name of it, that is in clouds that could potentially do this. I still think it's a bit of a stretch. I can't believe that this is possible, but the story does a good job of convincing you that it might be possible. So from that perspective, it quite worked. This is interesting in the fact that the characters they're not your prototypical heroic type characters. They're of different sexualities and different lifestyles and whatnot. A very colorful cast of characters, the neighbors of the protagonist of this story, and the fact that people can accept things so quickly, I think, no matter how strange they are, I think is an interesting observation of the story as well. I particularly like the fact of where he's going to the football field with all those bodies, and they're also lining up for food from McDonald's and stuff at the same time. Like I thought that was pretty funny. So yeah, I really enjoyed this story as well. Not quite as much as the other one, but because it's another post-apocalyptic story. So and there's so many of those stories, but this is definitely the most unusual one that I've ever read. So yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think this. For me, this was the weakest story. Yeah. I think basically because I didn't really buy into it. That I like I did with the previous one, the man landing on a cloud.
Right.
That was totally believable. No, I think that I don't know exactly why, but this I think this one, it felt the weakest to me, and I can't really explain. But I think that in the circumstances, I guess you have to buy into a lot of stuff to get these stories to be believable. But I had the hardest time with this one. I did like the name though of the girlfriend, Honeysuckle Speck. I don't know. Is that a usual English name?
No.
No.
No. So
I had never heard it before, so I thought it wasn't. But I mean, you never know if there are names out there that you might be usual that you haven't heard of.
Right.
But I think my favorites are. I think Aloft is my favorite of the four, and Rain is the weakest one. I think. I think also Rain is the most political one. I mentioned Trump a little bit and more critical to the government, I think. But all in all, I think it's a very good collection. Definitely worth them. I think that Joe Hill really has a brilliant future in his career. I mean, I've read all his books and none of them are bad. I think all of them are good. So I think he will be once King stops, I think he will be the next one I move over to as a favorite author, because there's a lot of similarities between those two. And so I enjoyed it very well, and that you check it out.
It's an interesting collection for sure. And I have a question for you, and it might be an unfair one, but I'll set it up first. I would just want to set it up. Because you mentioned off the top, you said you're wondering why there was 4 stories in this collection, and I was too for a different reason. And I don't know if it was a subconscious or a conscious act on Joe Hill's part, because he started out his career, well, he used a different last name because he wanted to distance himself from his father. But and maybe I'm just in connections that aren't there, but I get the feeling that with the last couple of books, he's grown quite comfortable with the idea of being open that he is Stephen King's father. And actually some of his stories, I'm thinking of the Nosferatu, openly reference elements from Stephen King stories as well. So with this book, I don't know if he deliberately set out to create his version of different seasons, but it is more, I think it's more than a coincidence that there's 4 stories in this collection, and it's called Strange Weather, which is like Stephen King's collection of different seasons, which has 4 stories. Yeah. And I think the differences between the 2 writers are more in the obvious generational differences between the 2, because Stephen King is from our generation or ahead for other readers, whereas Joe Hill is behind me and you, and he represents more the next generation of readers in that. And so it's the stories that he writes are a little more diverse in his characters in that, and maybe more representative of the real world. So I don't know, did that strike you? Did you think of that at all? Or
well, I think definitely he's totally open now with being Stephen King's son.
Yeah.
I think I read in some interview with him that the reason he didn't want to do it at the beginning was because he wanted to prove to himself that he actually was good enough to be published.
Right. Yes.
Based on his stories and not his father's name. And I think now that he has definitely done that, so then there's no reason to hide that he's his son.
Right.
What would be interesting, though, and what I'm missing a little bit, I would like to hear from both of them talking more about how they together have inspired each other and stuff like that. Even though he's not hiding that it's Stephen King's son, he's not really talking about how King has influenced him, how when he was younger, if he wrote stories together and stuff like that. A little bit of what Owen and Stephen did now on the tour. They talked about when Owen was young and he read books on tape for King and stuff like that. That would be interesting to hear more about, I think.
All right.
But I don't know if I had any thoughts about this being his version of different seasons. And I don't know if I would compare the two to being very similar, except for the format and the number of stories and
the titles,
slight resemblance in the titles. But I don't think that these 4 stories in Strange Weather are that similar to King stories in different seasons. But I guess, I don't know. I don't think he set out to, this is going to be my version of different stories, but maybe subconsciously it has some bearings from that. It's hard to say.
Yeah, it might be it might be an homage to his dad, but maybe it just because they had these 4 stories and it's shit. My dad did that. Why don't I do that? Something like that too. So my question is, which collection do you like better? And that might not be a fair question, because as you said, the 2 stories, collections of stories are so different, and it's like comparing a baseball team or a sports team from the 70s to one in the 21st century too. So
yeah,
and obviously we have so many decades of emotional connections to the first set of stories.
Yeah. I think that first, the fact that doing 4 stories in a book might have been more the publisher's idea. Oh, Stephen King did this, so we can do this with this one as well, more than Joe's maybe. But if I had to choose one, I think I would pick different seasons.
Right.
But I don't think that one has to. I hope that one doesn't has to exclude the others, because I think that they together gave us 4 very good stories.
Yeah.
So I think they complement each other good. But if I had to pick one, I think I would go with different seasons.
Yeah, it's definitely an unfair question, but I was just curious because to me the similarities are too much to be a coincidence. So if he's going to invite that comparison, then I just can't help but make it. So, but I'd be interested to hear from our readers or listeners what they think of these, if they've read both collections, which one they like better. And it would be interesting to see along age lines too, which people would prefer one over the other. But to summarize, as you said, this is a great collection of short stories. I'm really impressed with every new work that Joe Hill comes out with is distinctly different from his previous ones, and that only bodes well for his future and longevity as a writer.
Yeah, and one thing, when since we are on the subject of comparing the two, it's interesting to see that I feel that a lot of fans are collecting Joe Hill books, first edition, signed editions, and stuff like that, almost hoping that they will become what a, say, signed first edition of Carrie would be today.
Right.
And I don't know if that is going to happen. It sure will be good for those who buys a lot of copies and signed copies and stuff like that. But I don't know if... I guess a market is being created by a lot of people willing to buy the books now. But I think that a lot of people are hoping that this will be like Stephen King the second time around, and a lot of people probably didn't really know about collecting books in back when Carrie was released. So I get the feeling that some people are trying to get the same thing out of Joe Hill now, and like 20 years down the line, or 30 years down the line, they will have a signed first edition of his first book, and that will be like having a first edition signed Carrie. I think that's an interesting observation, and personally, I haven't jumped on that train, but it's interesting to see what will happen and if it will happen.
Yeah, I agree. I think the whole idea of collecting editions now is, in today's age, when printing is so much, not just printing, but access to media is so different and can come in so many different forms, be it electronic or print, that the idea of first print editions, I don't know, will they hold that kind of value going forward as opposed to what happened previously? I'm not sure anymore, but we'll have to see.
Yeah.
Alrighty, so that is our review of Strange Weather. I almost said different seasons, but I didn't.
Well, we talked about that as well. So.
Yeah.
Okay, next up, we are going to talk about Shining in the Dark. That is edited by yours truly. This book actually came about 2.5 years ago, when I was thinking about how to celebrate that Lilja's Library had been alive for 20 years. I think I was talking to Brian Freeman at Cemetery Dance, and at one point he said that why don't we put together an anthology with short stories to celebrate the site. And I thought, of course, that sounded extremely fun, extremely scary, and I had no idea how to do it. But I thought that the most important thing would be to have a story by Stephen King included in it, if it should be a celebration of the site. So I set out to do that. After some time and some talks and discussions, I got the right to use the Blue Air Compressor, which is a story that has been published in 1971 and in 1981 in newspapers, and nothing more than that. So I thought that was an interesting story to publish, because it's one that I think that most readers might not have read. And it's also an interesting story because it's written by a young Stephen King, and he is actually addressing the readers in this book, talking to them in the story. And I thought that was quite interesting, because that's also something he hasn't done after that. So when that story was secured, I set up to fill the book with other stories, and ended up with 12 stories all in all, which of those 12, 9 is totally unpublished before this book. A couple of them is written directly for this book, actually. And the book is released by Cemetery Dance probably early 2018 or late this year, but as Christmas is coming closer, I think it might not be out this year, but probably early next year. It was released in Bulgaria, in Bulgarian, on November 20 in paperback, and it will also be released in Italian in March. And there might be other language coming up later on, but it's an interesting book, and I'm be able to release it. Some galleys has been sent out from Cemetery Dance, and one of them landed on Lilja. And you have read the book, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think about it.
Yes, Hans is on pins and needles, because I haven't really told him my overall feelings of the book. So I want to say, first of all, congratulations to you for putting this collection together.
Thanks.
It's an excellent collection. I really enjoyed reading it. Obviously, some stories I enjoyed more than others, as with any anthology. And my list of favorite stories, like we just found out with Strange Weather, are probably going to be different than, or are sure to be different than other people's. It's the first chance that I've ever had to read Blue Air Compressor by Stephen King. So that was a very interesting piece. As you mentioned, he inserts himself authorially into the story, which was a little bit jarring. It's different than the way he did his incorporating himself into the Dark Tower series, and comparing those two. Understandably, this piece feels much more like he was trying to be literary, as opposed to the Dark Tower, which is just a tale. So that was interesting. There's elements of almost like Edgar Allan Poe and Lovecraft in that story. So for Stephen King completionists, you'll be very happy to be able to finally read this story if you haven't gotten it previously in the earlier printings that Hans mentioned, which were like 30, 40 years ago now. So definitely worth reading that story. And it's also an interesting time capsule to compare the Stephen King authorial voice from when he wrote this story to where he is now. So I really enjoyed reading that. There's a couple of knockout stories in here. And the one that you've mentioned that you actually got to edit quite a bit is The Keeper's Companion with the Swedish writer John Lindqvist. I think that's probably my favorite story in the whole collection.
Oh, yeah.
It's also the last one in the anthology. Yep. So your collection really sticks the landing, because that was a fantastic tale. And I don't want to give away too much about it, but it's basically about Dungeons and Dragons and Lovecraft as well. So it's interesting that the first story that touches on that, and the last story in the collection also touches on those themes. So that was pretty good. And then there's Richard Chizmar's Cemetery Dance, which is a nice, tight, short uppercut of a story. I really liked it. I mean, a lot of readers will know him now from Gwendy's Button Box, but I've also read his short story collection, which is really quite good. And this story is just the perfect length. And it's a really nice mood piece that I really enjoyed. And Richard's a real deal. Like he's a good writer. I've really enjoyed everything I've read by him. So he might be best known as an editor, but he's a pretty damn good writer too. So I really enjoyed that story. And the other story that I really, really liked was Brian Keene's story, An End to All Things, which almost sounds like the last episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, but it's a really good story. And Brian writes, if there's ever a writer that I think that writes with his own blood, it's Brian. He really bears his soul in his stories, and there's always a real strong element of biographical elements in the story, and this one is no different. And I quite enjoyed that, and I'm looking forward to when we interview him to find out how much of that is autobiographical and how much isn't, because the line is a little blurred there sometimes. So, and I don't want to shortchange any of the other stories. A Mother's Love. Another excellent story. Bev Vincent's got a story in here, Alina, which seemed like a tip of the iceberg story. It seems like it could be the part of a much bigger story, which I was really curious to the mythology and the characters that he's up in that story. So, and then Jack Ketchum and P.D. Chasik have a story in here as well about the internet and its ability to warp our perceptions about other people and that. So, Clive Barker, who I haven't read in a while, but it was good to see him back with his story as well. So yeah, this is it's a really strong collection, and I think in general we'll be very pleased to pick up this collection. And Stephen King collectors, and of course, will be very happy to finally get their hands on the Blue Air Compressor. Yeah, it's a really great collection, Hans. Congratulations, and congratulations to all the writers who contributed to this. I think it's a really strong collection with a couple, for me, really standout stories.
Cool. I'm really happy that you liked it.
Yes. Yeah.
I was nervous.
Yes, I know you.
Never know.
I know you were.
Yeah.
I would be. I think whoever picks this book up is going to be very happy that it's going to be money well spent, because this is a very, very strong collection.
Yeah, and hopefully there will be, as you mentioned. I mean, I think that the stories are quite different if you compare them to each other. Yeah. So I think that maybe a couple of people will have some favorite and others will have other favorites.
Exactly,
so
for sure.
Hopefully there's something for anyone in there. And I'm happy that you liked The Keeper's Companion, because it's by the Swedish author, and it was really interesting. Actually got to be involved in some of the translation. It's, I guess I could speak an entire podcast episode about making a book, editing a book, contacting the authors, the rights holders, everything. And also the book being released in different markets. I mean, that's nothing I have ever been close to doing earlier. So that's a very interesting and scary experience.
Yeah. Oh, you forgot to.
But also,
you forgot to mention that in your news. You're going on a trip.
Yes, exactly. I'm actually in the beginning of January. I'm going to Bulgaria to promote this book. I've been invited to do a book signing in Sofia, the town. So that will be really interesting to talk to all the Bulgarian fans and hear their version of what they think about the book and everything like that. So that's really interesting, and it's a totally new experience. So I'm very excited about that.
Awesome. So again, congratulations to you and everybody who contributed to the anthology. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Okay. And now we're here with our guest, Brian Keene, who, as we mentioned when we talked about Shining in the Dark, has written An End to All Things. That's included. First of all, thank you for writing this story for the book.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thanks for having me on the show as well.
Yeah, this story hasn't been published anywhere else, right?
Correct. Yep.
I think you mentioned that you read it out loud.
I've done a few public readings for it. So so far the crowd of the folks that have gotten to hear it have really enjoyed it. So
yeah, and I can reveal that Lou had it as one of the favorite stories in the book.
Yes.
Oh, nice.
Definitely. Yeah, just read it this week and prep for the podcast. So as usual, your stories tend to be feel like they're very autobiographical. Yeah. And this one definitely is situated basically sounds like it's just outside your front door. The setting,
it is.
The setting at least.
Yeah,
so
it is.
Yeah.
I mean, when I originally got the invite for the anthology, I wanted to do a Stephen King style story, of course, but I didn't want to. I figured everybody would go for the classic era. Everybody would be trying to duplicate and capture the spirit of Night Shift or Skeleton Crew or maybe different seasons. And I wanted to do something from his later years. I think one of his best collections is Just After Sunset.
Right.
And I truly believe most of the stories in Just After Sunset could not have been written by younger Stephen King. They are stories written by somebody who's lived life and who's experienced life.
Right.
So I wanted to try to capture some of that. And as always, I usually draw from real life. The house in the story is my house. The dock outside in the river, those are mine. My morning ritual is go out there and feed the ducks every day. But obviously, I'm a much happier person than the protagonist.
That's good, because I was going to ask if that was based on any real life material.
Well, it's weird. The way I got the idea for the story, my next door neighbor, who has a dock next to my boat dock, I came to find out that about 20 years ago, his young son fell off the dock and died. He drowned there in the river.
Oh, wow.
And this guy has never moved. He's stayed in the same house. I see him out there on his boat dock, and I'm a father. I know I could not do that. If God forbid something like that happened to one of my children, I couldn't stay in that house a day after. And he had done so. And in talking with him, I come to find out, well, he didn't move because they couldn't afford to move. And that was where the genesis of the story came from. This protagonist, he's trapped there in this haunted house, but it's not, I don't think this is a spoiler warning. It's not haunted by anything supernatural. It's haunted by memories.
Right.
Yeah.
And it stemmed out of that.
Wow, it's very powerful. You're one of those writers that always strikes me as when they talk about writing with their own blood, that seems to be the kind of stories that you write with, because it's very powerful, very emotional story.
Well, thanks. I mean, sometimes you just write for fun.
Right.
I can write a zombies versus dinosaurs versus cowboys story, and that's just me having fun, and hopefully the audience will have fun with it too.
Yeah.
But sometimes, especially for a project like this, you really want to give it your best. And I think when you're going for that, I think you do have to get personal. I think you have to draw from deep down inside.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Just After Sunset, because this story has that same sort of vibe as, and I don't know the title off the top of my head, the one that King wrote about, the post-apocalyptic story about the guy with the motorcycle. I think it was Summer Thunder or something like that.
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The story reminded me of that one quite a bit. Is that something that you are also aware of, or?
Not consciously,
okay.
But I'm sure it's there. If I go back and read it, I'm sure I'll, well, I don't know if I can curse here or not, but
sure.
I mean, that's happened.
Go ahead.
Happened before, I can vividly remember writing my novel, A Gathering of Crows, and it used this plot device of a soul cage being placed around this small town in Virginia, and nobody could leave, nobody could get in.
Right. And
one of my opening scenes, this carload of teenagers trying to drive out of town, and they run into this invisible soul cage and smashes them up. I turned the novel into my publisher at the time, and like a month after I turned it into them, we're still like 8 months from it being published.
Yeah.
A month after, Under the Dome comes out.
Yeah.
And I'm reading Under the Dome, and there's an invisible dome over this small town, and an airplane hits it.
Yeah.
And vice versa. When Stephen King's novel Cell came out, people were just emailing me and hitting me up on social media, and they're like, "Hey, this is just like your novel, The Rising. he ripped you off." And I'm like, first of all, you idiots, he didn't rip me off. I don't know. Great minds think alike, I think.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
I haven't talked about this publicly at all. For the last 2 years, I've been working on a collaboration with Bev Vincent, author Bev Vincent,
right?
Who I'm sure a lot of your readers will be familiar with.
Yep.
The idea was we were going to each write a novella and then include them together in a collection. The first draft of my novella was done, and then I can't remember the most recent Stephen King novella collection. Can't remember what it was called, but there was a story in there. It was the same plot. I mean, just the exact same plot.
Okay.
And I emailed Bev and I said, well, we're going to have to wait about another year because I got to scrap this entire novella and come up with something from scratch. And he thought he got a good kick out of that. But,
right.
Yeah, it's weird, man.
Yeah, ideas seem to come up like when you had what was that, those two meteorite movies? Oh, geez, I can't remember now. Armageddon and the other one with Elijah Wood, with Morgan Freeman and Elijah Wood, The Day After or something like that. Yeah, it's funny how that happens. And I know that reading your other stuff as well, you've been through this before, because like you came out with The Rising around the same time that Kirkman came out with The Walking Dead. So it's, yeah, you know.
Oh yeah, there was a 3-month window. Kirkman dropped the first issue of Walking Dead. I dropped The Rising, and people forget Danny Boyle dropped 28 days later around that time. It was all in a like a 3-month window there. What's remarkable, you look at each one of those. You know, one's a comic book, one's a film, one's a novel, but they all in some way involve a parent looking for their child. They all have a strong woman of color as a main protagonist. It's very weird, the similarities between the three. You know, Alan Moore, the comic book writer and novelist, Alan Moore, he's far more spiritual and occult minded than I am, but he has this idea I'm fascinated with. He says there is this dimension that he calls idea space, and he says that all artists subconsciously tap into this dimension, and that's where we all get our inspiration from, and that explains why you have things like that happen. You know, 7 different artists and 7 different mediums get the idea for zombies at the same time, or what have you.
Yeah, it's like the story pool in Lisi's story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me, Brian, was Lilja the hardest editor you had to work with?
No. Lilja was a dream. I mean, you know, no, this has been wonderful. This has been a wonderful process. No, you've been great to work with. I've had difficult editors.
Yeah.
You are not one of them.
No, I think I read the story and I fell for it straight away. So I didn't ask you to change anything in it. And I love the title of it. And I actually, for a few minutes, pondering if I should have that name on the book, an end to all things.
Wow.
And I actually told my wife, and she said, "No, you can't have that. People will think you're going to drop the site, and this is the last thing you do." So, but I love the title of it. It's really dark and scary, and as Lou can attest to, is that I love stories that doesn't end well, and
Right.
Yeah. So I think this without spoiling too much, this story doesn't have the happy ending, and so it's really a story that I like.
Well,
I'm
thanks.
very happy that you wrote it.
And I don't think that's a spoiler. I think after I think I've written 52 books now, if you count short story collections. I think people have figured out that I'm not much of one for a happy ending. So, you know.
Yeah. How does it work? Like when I asked you for a story, did you just sit down and write that, or did you have something planned?
No, I accepted right away. And, you know, because I've told you before off the air, I'm a fan of the website, longtime reader of the website. So, you know, I wanted to do it right away. It was just a matter of, I didn't want to just write you a story. I wanted to give you something really good. So it was a matter of sitting down and waiting for the inspiration to hit me. Luckily, it hit pretty quick. And, you know, I have to say, I've written, I guess, over 250 short stories at this point in my career. I've been doing this about 21 years. I think this may be my favorite short story of anything that I've written. You know,
wow.
So you know, it really all seemed to just come together.
Yeah, it's definitely up there. I think Girl in the Glider is really good too, but that's more. Is that more of a novella though? I can't remember how.
Yeah,
long it was.
I would count that as a novella lengthwise.
Yeah.
That's a weird one. That one. I can talk about this publicly. She doesn't care. My marriage was falling apart, and I wrote that as in a sort of a bizarre Hallmark greeting card effort to try to save my marriage. It didn't work ultimately, but you know, I got a really good novella out of it. A lot of people really, it seems to touch them, and you know, they've written to me and they've told me how it's helped their own relationship. So you know, I'm glad it worked for other people.
How would you describe yourself as an author for those who haven't read your books? You have done a lot of books and a lot of stories, and you've edited books, collections, and a lot of different things. You're very productive. I just checked, and you haven't had any books translated into Swedish yet.
Not yet. I'm happy to, though. If there's a publisher in Sweden listening right now.
There you go, Hans.
Go
bug 'em.
Yep.
Hit
I'm
'em
going to go bug them.
Yep.
Yeah, Swedish publishers are very hard to please, I guess. But how would you describe yourself? And if you're a King fan, is there a special part of your books that you should start with, or how would you describe
Absolutely. I mean, I always tell people I don't think of myself as a horror writer. I think of myself as a horror fan. I have been a fan of this genre since I was 6 years old. You know, at first it was comic books, then I moved on to actual prose novels. And Stephen King certainly was one of my first. I discovered him. Marvel Comics did an adaptation of The Lawnmower Man.
Oh, yes.
And, you know, I guess I was maybe 10 years old, 11 years old at the time. And the story just blew me away. I didn't know anything about the great god Pan yet or any of that. I was like, wow, that was weird. And I saw a copy of Night Shift on the newsstand, and Stephen King, that's the guy that wrote that Marvel comic last month. I picked it up and read it, and a week later I found Salem's Lot, read that, and then I was hooked. Mm-hmm. He was definitely my first, but I love all aspects of the genre. I read Joe Lansdale, Peter Straub, the Splatterpunks, a big influence on me. Richard Lehman, another really big influence. Jack Ketchum, so Charlie Grant, and they're all very diverse. A Jack Ketchum novel is very different than a Skip Inspector novel, and those are very different than a Charles Grant novel. And I think what that has brought for me as a writer is I don't get pigeonholed into one style of horror. I've certainly written extreme things such as urban gothic. I've written quiet horror, like we mentioned The Girl in the Glider a moment ago. And, I've written some Stephen King style stuff too, just, some mainstream pop horror. I would say if you're a Stephen King fan, particularly, and you haven't tried my stuff, I think Dark Hollow certainly owes a little bit to Stephen King. Darkness on the Edge of Town, which the man himself enjoyed. He was very kind enough to tweet about it, which was unexpected. I didn't know that was going to happen. And, it was a fantastic moment. Mm-hmm. I'd say, those two are perhaps the Complex. The Complex, it's like if David Cronenberg directed a Stephen King story, perhaps.
I'm curious too, because you said you had some early influences from King, and I know that you've built up your own connected universe. Was that something that you saw King doing that you wanted to try, or was that something that you had in mind from the beginning?
It wasn't so much his mythos. I had it in mind from the beginning.
Okay.
And certainly I loved the connections in his books. I love the connections in Peter Straub's books.
Right.
Joe Lansdale's Mud Creek, of course. But for me, that all goes back really to Marvel Comics and DC Comics. I was, as I said, those were my initial influence. And, I was reading them as a kid in the 70s, and everything was connected. What happened in an issue of Spider-Man would be referenced 2 months later in an issue of The Incredible Hulk. And if you weren't reading Spider-Man, you had to rush out and try to find that issue. And
right.
Nowadays in modern times, of course, we've seen that carry over into their cinematic universe, and it's brought them great success. But
right.
Yeah, I knew from day one when I first seriously started writing for publication. And what I mean by that, I've been writing since I was 6 years old, but I started writing for publication with publication in mind when I was about 25 years old, I guess. And I knew from day one, I wanted all to be connected, just like the Marvel universe. So that's really the genesis of that.
Right.
I don't know if I've told this. I think maybe I've told this story on my podcast. The first thing I actually finished writing, I was in high school detention. I had detention for 2 months. And every day I'd get to school, and while the rest of my friends went to class, I had to go to detention. And, I'd get my homework done in like the first hour. And then, I got 7 hours left with nothing to do. And I sat there and I wrote The Mist by hand in a notebook. I copied it out of what was in, and I think it was in Dark Forces, Kirby McCauley's Dark Forces. And
right.
I did it just because I wanted to get a feel of what it's like to write The Mist, which is probably, one of my favorite works by King.
Yeah.
Years later, I read an interview with Hunter S. Thompson. He had done something similar. He had I think he had retyped The Great Gatsby by hand just to get a feel. And I thought, okay, see, I'm not the only weirdo out there that does.
Yeah, no, I've heard that as a writing exercise, just to get because when you read something, you read it at sort of at one level, but when you have to sit down and actually transcribe it, you get into a deeper level and you realize, wow, this is really well put together.
Yeah.
It's at a different level than just reading it, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, also you also run a podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Absolutely. It's called The Horror Show with Brian Keene, and I'm happy to report we actually just last week we got our 200,000th download for the year. So for the year 2017, we've had over 200,000 downloads. It's a weekly show. I basically spend the first half of the show talking about genre news that impacts people. Perhaps it's the passing of an icon. We just did a show about George Romero.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier this year, we did a show about Robert Bloch on what would have been his 100th birthday. In fact, Stephen King contributed some material for us for that episode, as did many other fine folks.
Nice.
So the first half of the show is news or something of import. And then the second half, I usually interview either an author or an artist or comic book writer. We've had film directors. We've had musicians. We had, if anybody out there is a heavy metal fan, we had Jeff Tate, the former lead singer of Queensryche. We had him on this year and talked about his connections to the horror genre, which I bet a lot of fans of Queensryche probably weren't aware of. And it's just, I'm very lucky enough in this business. I pretty much know everybody at this point.
Right.
I only like about half of them, but I know everybody. But
I didn't think that many.
But it's so if I'm sitting down with, I'll use Rath James White, for example, author Rath James White. We had him on earlier this year. I've known Rath 15 years now. He's a dear friend, and I know from that friendship questions I can ask him that other interviewers they aren't going to be aware of.
Right.
And it becomes a conversation, and people really seem to respond to that. And as a fan of the genre, I'm proud to be doing it because I feel that I'm building an archive, sort of like what Stanley Wyatter did back in the day. I'm building this archive that fans generations from now can hopefully have access to, and they can go back and they can listen to different creators talk about their process.
Right. And does doing a podcast help you with your writing in any way, or are you strictly, is this like kind of your pay it forward to the next generation of writers type of endeavor that you're doing this podcast?
It started as a pay it forward idea. It actually started author J.F. Gonzalez before he died. It was all his idea. He suggested that myself and him and our friend Dave Thomas and our other friend Jeff Cooper just sit around every week and do a podcast and talk about horror fiction and the history of horror fiction. And he passed away, unfortunately, before we could launch it. But
right.
I also, not only was I a Stephen King fan as a kid, I was also a big fan of Howard Stern.
Oh, okay.
and Merv Griffin. I always like watching Merv Griffin with my parents. And I thought, what if we could take Jesus's idea and focus on the genre, but what if we could bring Merv Griffin's style of interviewing and bring a little bit of Howard Stern's irreverence to the process? I think it would keep people entertained. And what we're seeing is it's working. I'm shocked, to answer your question, Hans, I'm shocked at the number of listeners we're hearing from who aren't necessarily fans of the horror genre, or they aren't necessarily fans of mine. And they're listening to the show every week just because they're entertained and they're learning things. Yeah, I mean, not to sound arrogant, I've been doing this 21 years. I really thought I had reached my peak audience, and I probably wouldn't be picking up any new readers. And I'm finding the opposite. I'm finding people our age are aware of my books, but millennials, I'm not their go-to writer, and they're discovering me through the podcast and then going out and picking up my books. So it's like finding a whole new audience for me.
Yeah. And it really makes a difference when people like you doing podcasts, people that know about stuff, have some insights to it, and they can do an interesting it's the same with if you're doing interviews and writing articles and stuff like that. Most journalists that are just doing their jobs doesn't really have that insight and can't ask these really interesting questions. And it's very superficial interviews and stuff. But if you know your stuff, you can ask the right questions and talk about the right angles and everything. And that really makes a difference, I think, for the listeners.
I agree.
And, how interesting it is to listen to it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's the spontaneity too. I think because I listened to your podcast, I think one of my favorite episodes is when the neighbors were walking by or the window or something, and you invited them in, and the guy started asking you what you were doing and all that stuff.
Oh yeah, the meth heads next door.
Yeah, that was hilarious.
I ended up. There's two characters in my novel, The Complex, which a lot of people have asked. Were they based on the meth heads next door? They were, in fact, based on the meth heads.
Oh, that's too much. But you have your finger in a lot of pies, because I'm also on the Cemetery Dance list. You're currently running a series of articles on the history of horror fiction.
Right.
And was that something that you brought to Cemetery Dance, or did they approach you about that?
No, it was. I've been friends with Rich, 20 years now. Cemetery Dance's headquarters is about a 20-minute drive from my home. So, I get down there. I see those guys quite often. We do lunch. And, I knew that they'd been looking for content for the Cemetery Dance website to increase traffic, to get people to come there on a regular basis. So back in 2016, I had proposed to Rich. I said, I'm going to go out on this book signing tour. I don't want to do any more book signing tours because I've got an 8-year-old at home and I want to spend more time with him. So this is going to be like my last really big, extensive tour. What if I blogged about it, every week for the website? Would you be interested? And he was. And I think I can say it was a good investment for him because it really drove traffic to the website. People read it regularly. And when it was over, he said, well, if you get an idea for something else, hit me up. And so in thinking about it, I said, well, I'd really like to write an extensive history of horror fiction. We have really good histories. We have, of course, Stephen King's Danse Macabre. We have Grady Hendrix's Paperbacks from Hell. Douglas Winter is written at length, John Peelin, many others, but they all focus on certain time periods. I wanted to do something starting all the way back with Beowulf and coming all the way up to where we're at now with the success of Kindle self-publishers and authors like that. Mm-hmm. And so I pitched it to Rich and to Brian Freeman at Cemetery Dance, and they thought people would like it. And so far, people seem to be digging it. I think we're, by the time this airs, we'll be 2 chapters in, and the feedback's been very positive so far. So
very cool. Yeah, it's like a similar to what you did with your Hail Satan columns that you eventually collected and published. So I imagine you're looking at doing something that's similar with this as well.
Absolutely. The Hail Satan stuff, it's out of print now. People ask if I'll ever bring it back into print. I don't think I will. It's a lot of it is, I think there's some good stuff there, but it's the work of a very young author. And a lot of it, in going back and rereading it, it just seems so dated because the industry has changed so much since when that stuff was written.
Right.
But this new stuff, like this thing I'm doing for Cemetery Dance now, that's purposely not dated. It's something we can still go back and look at 20 years from now, I think.
Right. Very cool.
It sounds like you have your plate full with writing books and stories and podcast and everything
Believe
else.
Believe it or not, this is me trying to slow down.
Oh.
Yes. Your latest projects, I know you're working on the 3rd book, Rising series.
5th book, right? Actually. Yeah.
5th. Oh, my apologies. And that's close to being published?
No.
No? Oh.
Cemetery Dance has the rights to the hardcover for that. And I told Rich, look, this is going to be about 200,000 words. This is going to be like the length of The Stand. And I don't, I'm not known for writing big doorstop books. Most of my novels come in 70,000 to about 90,000 words. I think the longest is City of the Dead, which came in at like 95,000 words. And so it's going to take me longer to write it. The other thing is, I've started to feel the creep of arthritis, so I'm not typing as fast as I could when I was 30. We have it slated for publication in 2019. I'll finish it next year. But yeah, it's nowhere close to being done yet.
Okay. Yeah, you have to look into, I don't know if you've tried it, dictating your
I've
books or
tried
something.
it. Kevin J. Anderson recommended I try. He told me he'll go hiking and he'll dictate a novel and then he sends it to his assistant. But I can't really afford an assistant, so I'm going to have to end up typing it anyway.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of Stephen King material out this year. Obviously a lot of stuff on Netflix, right, which must be very encouraging for other horror writers or just writers in general to see these new avenues for your stories to appear in. I'm just curious, do you have anything going on in that vein? And what was your favorite King adaptation this year?
Well, I'll go with the second question first. I really liked Netflix's adaptation of Gerald's Game.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of the novel, and I know people look at me cross-eyed when I say that, but screw them. I'm a big fan of Gerald's Game. That I thought as a reader, it was creepy as hell, and as a writer, to so much of that novel is just one character, alone with her mind, and to make that work. It just, it's masterful writing. So I really like that adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's box office success. That's great for everybody.
Yeah.
As far as my own stuff, I do have some stuff in the works. Unfortunately, I'm very limited on what I can say because I've signed a bunch of non-disclosure agreements. I've got something in front of the folks at Amazon right now. I've got something in front of the folks at Netflix. I have a showrunner gig next year.
Wow.
Again, I can't talk about.
Yes, I saw that in your last newsletter. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a weird thing. That is a media property, a series that they wanted to do another season of, and they tapped me for that. And then they decided, hey, this would work better as a prose serial, and they want to bring in a writing team and still have me showrun it, just like a television series. But now it's going to be prose instead. It's a really interesting concept.
Cool.
I'll be very excited when it can finally be talked about, because I think people are going to be excited as well. The only thing I can really mention safely, I was the executive producer on a feature-length horror film this year called I'm Dreaming of a White Doomsday. It's people ask me what it's about. I say it's like the Babadook meets The Road. It's a post-apocalyptic holiday film. It is dark. I mean, just dark. It's by a young filmmaker named Mike Lombardo.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got that out on the festival circuit right now. It's been getting really great reviews. It's got a very high IMDb rating. And right now we're shopping that to different distributors for Netflix or Amazon or Shudder, wherever. So folks should be able to see that at some point next year.
Cool. Look forward to it.
Oh,
yep.
Sounds great. I love Babadook. So
yeah, I did too. Too.
Great movie. And this is you slowing down?
This is me slowing down. Well, like I'm Dreaming of a White Doomsday. That I'm the executive producer, which basically means I sign the checks and I make sure everybody's fed. I make sure the caterer is on time. Other than that, I don't have to do any work. That's all the director.
Nice. So you're able to do all this work remotely. That's pretty amazing too. Like I'm talking about the media stuff, because normally you'd have to move to LA or New York or something, right?
Yeah, it's weird. People ask me how to get into that, and I realize it's when I become aware I really am speaking from a place of privilege. Because if I was a new author starting out, I don't know how to break into that.
Mm-hmm.
I got lucky enough that my books were popular enough that they came to me and asked me to write stuff like that. I'm not sure how a new author would break into that now. It's like people come to me and ask me what a good short story market is. Where should they submit their short story? I don't know. I haven't had to look for a short story market in 15 years. Like Hans comes to me and says, will you write one for my
Nice.
anthology?
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
I wouldn't know where to send people these days,
So, this kind of builds off of that. I'm just curious, what's your 5,000-foot view of the state of horror today? Is it in a good place? Is it going down? Is it on an upward trend?
I think we're in a very healthy place. Mm-hmm. I think in 2018, we will probably see some turmoil among the small presses.
Mm-hmm.
And by small press, I don't mean stalwarts like Cemetery Dance or Subterranean or PS Publishing. I mean, they're here to stay. But I think some of the newer small presses, particularly the ones that do a lot of ebook editions and trade paperbacks, I think you might see some of them fall by the wayside. But overall, especially in the mass market arena, horror is very healthy right now. They're not calling it horror, but you know, Josh Mallerman, Paul Tremblay, Sarah Pinborough, all have good dear friends of mine, all having enormous success, all deserved success.
Yeah, but I've read them all. They're all great. Yeah.
Rio Yours, The Forgotten Girl, which came out this year, probably easily one of my top 3 favorite novels of the year. I've been raving about it. I know Joe Hill's been raving about it. And, you know, it's a horror novel, but it doesn't say horror on the side.
All right.
So, yeah, I think the genre's in a very healthy place. Now, however, these things all run in cycles. So, you know, 5-10 years down the road, it'll have a dormant period again. Yeah.
I mean, even like Stephen King, like he's always been there, but this year has just been unbelievable.
Oh, yeah.
Like you just can't fathom it. Yeah. So, but I guess it's all like all the readers that were reading are now grown up and in those positions to actually produce the works that they read when they were younger. So
that's exactly it. And, you know, Stephen King still has new readers discovering him. Mike Lombardo, the director I mentioned that filmed I'm Dreaming of a White Doomsday, he's 30 years old, and he's very well read in the genre. You know, he reads Edward Lee, he reads Lehman, he reads Ketchum, he reads Lansdale. But he, growing up, when he was in high school, he wasn't reading Stephen King. He was reading my books. He was reading J.F. Gonzalez. And so now he's going back and reading all these Stephen King novels for the first time. In fact, I was just speaking with him yesterday. He's reading it for the first time. And it blows my mind that there's somebody out there that hasn't read it. Yeah. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, imagine to have all those books left to read.
Yeah. You know?
Yeah, that's a lifetime's work right there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I reread every year. I reread Salem's Lot, and every year I reread The Stand. But I would love to be able to go back and read them again for the first time.
Yes, for sure.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, I think we're getting close to the time. Is there anything that you wanted to mention that we haven't asked you about, or anything that you're really keen on making listeners aware of?
I see what you did there. I mean, you know, I would encourage listeners certainly to pick up the book, please. And the only other thing I would mention, can I talk about the charity I'm involved with real quick?
For sure.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm on the board of directors for a charity called Scares That Care. We are composed of horror professionals and horror fans. We are 100% nonprofit, meaning everybody, including the board of directors, we're all volunteers. None of us take a dime. Every year we raise money for a child with cancer, a woman fighting breast cancer, and a burn victim. And we've been doing this, I guess 5 years now. I think we're heading into our 6th year, and it's been very successful. And you know, we have a number of different fundraising activities throughout the year. But if folks would like to learn more about it or give us a hand, just visit scaresthatcare.org.
Awesome. And of course, they can check you out weekly on your podcast.
Yep, The Horror Show with Brian Keene. Yes. It's on iTunes or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. And of course, briankeene.com.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for being with us today, and again for the story, for the book. It's a great story, and I'm sure people will love it once the book is out.
Yes, thanks for
thank you guys.
Yeah, thanks very much. You. It's been a pleasure and honor to have you on the podcast. Thank you.
The pleasure and the honor are all mine.
Yes. All righty.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
So there you go, folks. We're pretty light on the news, but I'm sure that getting our reviews out for Strange Weather and Hans's Shining in the Dark, and of course, one of the horror giants currently in the field, Brian Keene, who graciously came aboard our podcast, as well as contributing a story to Hans's book that I'm sure that if once you read it, you're going to love it as much as everybody else has, as I did. So that wraps it up for this year, Hans. Quite a year.
I think, what a year and what an ending. I think we have, this must be the most fun year to do the podcast, because we have always had a lot to talk about this year. So hopefully it will continue the next year.
We've never had a shortage of topics, that's for sure. In fact, there's actually There's actually been a little too much. Oh well, it's better to have more than not enough for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is it for 2017 for us, and we will be back in early 2018. And our first episode will be a summarize of 2017. So
that's right.
That will be a long one, I suspect, because as we said, there have been a long year. And we would love to hear from you listeners, comment about what you enjoy the most, what you enjoy the least, and what you thought about the year 2017. I think it will go down in history as one of the best King years of all, I think.
Yep. It's been surreal at times, just how much King content that's been out. It's almost been hard to keep up with it all. And I'm actually hoping for a little bit of a slowdown so we can be a little more reflective about the things that we've talked about this year.
Yeah.
I think a lot of these things that, you have to give your opinion so close after you've watched it the first time, and you need the time for it to sit and percolate, and things that we might have not liked as much or really liked, our opinions might have changed with some time. So that'll be interesting to see going to next year as well. And of course, the big thing so far next year for us is the next King book, The Outsider. So we'll have that to look forward to as well. Hans, you've been very busy. Congratulations again on getting this collection together and 20 years with your site.
Yep.
I don't know if you want to run it for another 20 years, but
well, if King is up for it, I am certainly up for
it. There you go. So, to all listeners, we thank you all for sticking with us through thick and thin, and hopefully you've enjoyed the content. And if there's other things that you would like us to do, please send along those suggestions. But for now, as always,
stay safe,
but
stay scared.
Bingo!
Yeah,
got it right. All right.
First
okay.
try.
The end.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.